Okay, so we are here with a tutorial video. This video is for the Scratch String Combiner program. And here's the objective of this program. So we're gonna create a program that takes in two strings and a positive integer, that's a whole number. We'll call it n. And it prints out or says, that is the sprite will say this, the first n chars. And remember, chars means characters. So that is like letters in a word. So if a string is a word, chars or characters are the letters. And it's gonna return the first n chars of the first and second string concatenated. So before we jump into this, I'm actually gonna draw out sort of what this program is gonna do on our screen. And just some of the concepts that'll be covered in this video. We're gonna look at data types. So we'll look at strings and numbers. We're also gonna look at this thing called concatenation. That's where we combine strings or variables or a mixture of both. It's like we're adding them together, but we're not actually doing math, we're just sticking them together. We're also gonna look at creating and updating variables. We're gonna look at this thing called sequence. That's the order that you put your code in, super important. We're gonna look at selection. Those are if, then, else statements. And of course, we're gonna look at iteration. Those are loops. That helps to speed up our code and to sort of automate it so we don't have to do all the work. All right, so here's how this program is going to work. So we're gonna have a couple variables first off, and I'm gonna make them here. So we're gonna first need a string. We'll call this string str1. We're gonna need a second string. We'll call it str2. And if you remember, strings are just collections of characters. And in most programming languages, these will be inside of quotation marks, but strings can be anything like words, sentences, statements, anything like that. It can also be numbers or symbols, but they are, once they're a string, you can't really do any math with them. They're no longer numbers, they are strings. So we're gonna need these two strings. These are gonna be the two strings that we take in from the user. And then we're also gonna need a positive integer, which I will call num. So we've got a string one, string two, we've got a num. And then the other things we're gonna need is we're going to need the shortened versions of our string. So if you remember, we're going to print out the first n chars of the first and second string concatenated. So I'm actually gonna call this sub1 and I'll rewrite that, and sub2. The reason I'm saying sub is that in programming languages, not in Scratch, unfortunately, there is oftentimes a method or a function called substring. And substring is exactly what it sounds like. It's just a smaller string from the original string. And if that doesn't make sense, it should in just a second here. So let's say we write our program, and for the first string, we type in the word apple. So I'll just write that out. And for the second string, we type in the word grape. And say we type in the number 3. Now, our program is going to do the following. Because we typed in the number 3, our program should take the first 3 letters of our string 1 and string 2 and concatenate them. So that means that sub1 would be, I'll change that back. Sub1 will be app, A-P-P, those are the first 3 letters. And sub2 will be G-R-A. And then what should come out, what should actually print out, or the sprite will actually say, is app grape with no spaces. It should look something like that. So that is what we want our program to do in a nutshell. Now there are a couple things to consider here, and one of those is that the user should be allowed to type in any number that they want, except for a negative number. So, and we'll say basically, because if you look here, it says type in a positive integer. And so this should not be 0 or a negative number. So basically, num should be greater than 0. So it's going to be 1 upwards. Now, here's the problem though. So for this example here, the number 3 works because these strings right here, apple and grape, are not longer than the number 3. So for example, let's say for example, instead of writing in 3, let's say I wrote in the number, let's say 7. Okay. And real quick, in the word or the string grape, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There are 5 chars. Or I could say the length of string 1 is 5. And same goes for the word grape. So there's 5 chars in that. And if I type in the number 7, what would normally happen in a programming language is if we tried to find the first 7 letters of these 2 strings, we'd get an error because there are not 7 characters in this string. Now, Scratch is pretty smart and it will still work even if you type in 7, but we want to get used to using other programming languages also. So we're going to treat it as though this does not work. And so what we need to do is we need to tell Scratch exactly what to do if the number is larger than the length of the string. And what we'll do, we'll actually come back and look at this after we put together the first part of our program. We'll come back and look at these conditions and see if we can get it to work. So let's head over to Scratch and just get started on our program, and then we'll come back and finish up on the different conditions and kind of finishing up the program. All right, so we're here in Scratch, and the first thing you want to do is sign in. If you do not have an account, make sure you click Join Scratch and get signed up. Just remember, if you do want to share a project that you make in Scratch, you need to make sure to confirm your email address, otherwise it will not let you share. And I'll show you what I mean by that when we get to that point. But for now, I'm just going to sign in. And here's what your page should look like. We're going to click the Create button at the top left of the screen to create a new program. And the first thing I'm going to do is make sure I rename my program. And you should type in your last name, yours, not mine. And we're going to call this String Combiner. And there we go. So if you have not confirmed your email address, you will not see this orange button that says share. So if you get to the end of this project and you want to share your code and get a link for it, you won't be able to do that until you have confirmed your email address. All right, so the first thing I'm going to do is grab an event. The event is what allows us to initiate our program. So when I click the green flag, my code will run. So I'm going to grab one of those, and I need to go to sensing, and I need to get some input from the user. So the input block this is our input. This block allows us to get input from the user. And so what I want it to do is I want to say, please enter a string. And the thing is that what happens when I use this block, this answer to this question gets saved temporarily in this block right here. So if I click the green flag and I type test and I come over and click answer, you'll see that it says test. But when I click the green flag again, it's empty, because this is only temporary. And so what I do want to do is save the input from the user as a variable. That allows me to store the information where I can reuse it later. So I'm going to go to variables on the left, and I'm going to first make a variable called string, and we'll do what we did in our drawing earlier in the video. So I'll do str1. I know I need an str2 because I need the user to enter 2 strings. I need a number, which I'll call num, and I need a sub1 for the shortened string, the shortened first string, and I need a sub2 for my shortened second string. And I'll come over here and I'm going to say set string1 to whatever the answer the user types in. And then because I'm good at seeing patterns, I know I can just duplicate that block of code again. And I'm going to say, please enter another string. And I got to be sure to set this being string 2, set that to this answer. And then I'm going to duplicate it again. And I'm going to say, please enter a number. And we're going to set num to whatever the answer is. So let me unclick. Okay, good. So let's take a look over here on the right side. Let's test this out. So when I click the green flag, we'll type in apple like we did before. I'll type in grape. I'll type in the number 3. Notice how those 3 values get saved right up there. Okay, so far so good. Now here's what I want to do. I want to use whatever number the user typed in this case it's 3, to be able to take the 3 letters from the first string, 3 letters from the second string, and stick them together. So for that, let's look at how that works. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab a set block and I'm just going to move it over here. And what I want to do is I'm going to set sub1. That's going to be my first shortened string. Now, what I want to do next is grab an operator and look for the join block. So you can see the join block there. Now, what we're going to do is I want to start out with sub1 being totally empty. And what I'm going to do is when sub1 is empty, I am first going to add the first letter of my string 1, which is A in this case. I'm going to add that A first to sub1. And then I'm going to repeat the process, but with the next letter, which would be P. And then I'm going to do it 3 times in total because that's the number the user typed in. And that should give me the first three letters. So before we go any further, I'm going to draw this out so we can see it a little more clearly, and then we'll come back and finish it up with the code. Okay, we're back here. So we're looking at how we would get those first letters from our string and get them into a new string. So first off, let's go back and let's say we use the number 3 again, just because that's nice and easy. We'll say we got the number 3. So here's what's going to happen. We're going to have our sub1, and I'll put it down here. We'll have sub1. And we can think of sub1 as being an empty box. Sub1 is a variable, but we're going to make sure that it's empty. So when sub1 is empty, we're going to add the letters from our string 1 into this box until we have the first 3, because that's the number the user typed in. So what happens is on the first iteration of our code, what we're going to do is we're going to get the first letter of the word apple. And actually, let me draw this out so it's a little more clear again. So I'll draw apple like this. Now, the way this works in programming, and Scratch is a little different because it actually starts with the number 1, but each of these letters or chars, and let me write that also, just so we can see it, we can think of chars as letters. Now, that's not exactly true, but for this purpose, we can think of them that way. So we can think of chars as letters. And in Scratch, the first char starts at index 1, then index 2, then index 3, then index 4, then index 5. Okay, and that is the same as the length of So the length is 5, and the last char in this string is also 5. Again, a little different from other programming languages, but for now we'll just stick with this. So also these numbers right here, we call them indexes, or an index number. So our word or our string is called apple. It has 5 chars or 5 letters, and these are the positions of the letters. Now, because the user typed in the number 3, we want to take up to the 3rd letter and add it to our new empty string called sub1. So what'll happen is on the first run of our code, we're going to take the letter at index 1 of our string, and we're going to add it to our new variable. Okay, so that's iteration 1 right there. Then we're going to run our code again, but this time we're going to take the letter at the 2nd index, and we're going to add that to our variable. And then we're going to do it a 3rd time, and we're going to grab the 3rd letter. And notice here, this code will only run 3 times because that's the number that the user typed in. And then we would do the exact same thing to sub2. Except obviously it's a different word, so we pull the first 3 letters from that word, and we would slowly add them, G, then R, then A, then we got grape. And then the last thing that we would do in the program is concatenate the 2 together. So sub1 plus sub2. And that's going to give us, of course, our app gray. And actually, I wrote this wrong up here earlier. Oops. Shouldn't have the PE. That's what should print out. Okay, so let's see how to actually do this process, but in Scratch. So let's head back over to Scratch and take a look. Okay, so we're back, and here's what we want to do. You'll see that I have my sub1, and we can think of this like our empty box. However, as you can see, sub1 is currently 0. You can see that up here also, where the variable is. So whenever we click our green flag, we actually want to set sub1 to an empty string. So we want this to be totally empty. So when I click the green flag, you'll notice that sub1 is now totally empty. So once I have the information from the user, I'm going to go back to variables. I'm going to grab a set block, and I'm going to set sub1. And the way this works is I am going to set it to whatever is currently in sub1. And if I click here, you'll see that there's nothing there. Whatever is currently in sub1, I want to add to it and I come over to operators and I grab letter 1 of apple. And so I want to join to sub1. I want to join whatever's in sub1 with letter 1 of string 1, or whatever the user typed in. So if you remember, sub1 is empty, as you can see. String 1 has the word apple in it currently, because that's what I typed in. And you'll notice that if I click this block of code, watch what happens up here to sub1, this variable up here. When I click it, you'll see that an A got added. Now if I change this to the number 2, and click on the block, you'll see now that P has been added, because sub1 is currently A and P, and now I'm going to add the 3rd letter of string 1 to what's already in there, which is AP. So when I click on the block again, you'll now see that it's APP. Now here's the thing, this works, but our program should do this automatically, right? That's why we have computers. They work a lot faster than we do. We should not have to click this the number of times that the user wants. So here's where I'm going to create one more variable. And I'm going to call this variable lowercase I. And what I means is index. So that refers to the position of the letters or the chars inside of a string, just like we talked about before when we drew it out. So I am going to just stick this block right up here first underneath the when flag is clicked, because I always want I to be set to 1. And the reason that is because if you remember, the first letter of, or the first char of a string is number 1 in Scratch. So I always want this to be set to 1. So I means index, and it refers to the position of a char, letter in this case, in a string. That's all it means. So I is currently 1. So I click the green flag, you'll see string 1 still there, string 2 still there, num still there, sub 1 is empty, sub 2 is still 0, and I could probably just make sub 2 empty also, because I'm going to have to do that in a second. And then of course I is 1. Okay. So now instead of changing the number right here, I'm actually going to put in my lowercase I, because right now I is equal to 1. So if I click this block of code, notice that A gets filled in. Now here's the thing, how do I change I? Well, here's what I want to do. Each time I run this little block of code here, I want I to go up by 1. So let's take a look. Let's hit the green flag to kind of reset everything. Let's say I click this one time. I've got A, but notice how I is now 2. So if I click the block of code again, I add the P, and notice how I is now 3. So if I click the block of code again, I get my 3 letters. Cool. Now here's the thing, rather than clicking the block, let's use a loop. So I'm going to come over and grab a repeat loop, which is right here. And I'm going to attach this whole thing, but I do not want this loop to repeat 10 times. I only want it to repeat the number of times that the user typed in. Well, here's something cool. I can go to variables and grab num, which if you remember is currently 3. I can stick that in the repeat block. Let's try this out from the start. Let's enter a string. Let's enter watermelon, and let's enter pear. Hit enter. And for numbers, let's enter 4. Hit enter. And notice right here, sub 1, we got the first 4 letters of the first string. And you probably guessed it, I just need to do the same thing I did here, but to sub 2. So I'm going to duplicate this. Now remember, I do not need to change the I 2 times. If I change the I 2 times, actually, let me show you that. If I just did this, then each time I would actually go up by 2 on each loop. So if I ran this, and I'll go back to apple and grape and type 3, we're going to get something way off. So you'll notice it typed in all 7 letters because I kept increasing, or it increased multiple times. So I'm going to actually delete that block. And also you notice I kept this to sub 1. So I got to change that to sub 2. Let's get rid of this sub 2 and grab, or sub 1 and grab sub 2. And let's get rid of string 1 and grab string 2. Let's take a look at our variables up here as we run this. Okay, I'll do watermelon and pear and hit enter. And let's do the number 4 this time. So you'll notice we've got wat and pear. So we've got the first 4 letters of both substrings. All right, well, that's pretty easy so far, right? And then the last thing we really need to do is just go over to looks, grab a say block, which is pretty much a print block that's just printing out what the answer is. And we'll go over to operators and grab a join block. And we're just going to join sub 1 and sub 2. Sub 1 and sub 2. So let's run this. Let's see what happens. Let's type in puppy, kitten, and we'll type the number 3. And we got pupkit. Okay, so that does work. However, there is one issue. And if you remember, I told you that there's a couple things we need to make sure that happen, or we want to make sure happen. And here's what I mean by that. So Scratch is actually really smart, and it's going to fix this for us. But let's say I type in the word dog and then cat, but then I type in the number 15. Okay. You'll see that Scratch just put dog and cat together, even though I put the number 15 in. In other programming languages, that will not happen. You will actually get an error because there are not 16 characters in the string dog or cat. And so we need to get in the habit of programming that to make sure that that does not happen, that we don't get an error. And so what we're going to do, we're going to go back to our drawing board, and I'm just going to show you the key things that we need to make sure happen so that we don't get an error. Now, again, we're not going to get an error in Scratch, but we would get an error in if we were to use other programming languages. So we're just going to look at how to add that to our program just to make it really nice and secure, okay? So let's head back over to the drawing board. Okay. So we're back. Now, there are actually 4 conditions that we need to make sure occur so that we do not get any errors. Okay, so 4 conditions that we have to make sure are true. Or, for example, if one of the conditions is true, we do one thing. Otherwise, we check for the other condition, etc. So the first condition is this. So the first condition is if the number or the num that the user types in is less than the length of string 1 and string 2, both of them. So let's say, for example, let's pick a couple words that are kind of short. So let's go with, we'll go with apple again as string 1, and we'll go with pear as string 2. Okay, so apple is string 1, str1, and pear is str2. So string 1, string 2. And here's what would happen if the length is less. So let's say in this instance, let's say num is 3. So what's going to happen if num is 3? We should get APP, and we'll get PEA, like that. Okay, so if the number is less than the length, because remember, the length of apple is 5, the length of pear is 4, and so the number is less than the length of both of these. So it'll just return that value. Oops, sorry, crossed it out. It'll just return that value. Okay. The other condition, which is pretty simple. So this one's pretty simple because we just did it. The other condition is if the num is greater than the length of both string 1 and string 2. Length of string 1 and string 2. And I also forgot to mention right here, if I'm returning the shortened first string and second string, what I'm actually returning is sub 1 and plus sub 2. That's what I'm actually, that's what the cat is actually saying, sub 1 and sub 2. Otherwise, if the number is greater than the length of string 1 and string 2. So let's say, for example, here, let's say the number I type in is 7, right? And because the length of apple is 5, the length of pear is 4, what's going to actually happen is I'm going to see this, which is, or what I should see is apple and pear. It should return the whole thing, which means what's actually happening is I'm saying or printing str1 and str2. Okay, those are the first two conditions. Those ones are pretty easy. Here are the other two conditions, which are a little trickier to think about. Let's say, for example, let's go for 3. This is when num is, let's say, greater than the length of string 1. And in this case, actually, let's say num is greater than the length of string 2, but not string 1. Okay, so let's pretend that we type in the number, let's say we type in the number 5. And that's actually a bad example. Let me do this real quick. Let's change, just for this example, let's change apple to apples, plural. Just for this example, because that's a better example. Okay, so let's say we type in for num, let's say we type in the number 5. Okay, here's what should happen. What should happen is the number 5 is greater than the length of string 2, but it's not greater than the length of string 1. So if you look here, string 1 is 6 characters long, string 2 is only 4. So what's going to happen is, because I typed in 5, it's going to return just apple, but then it's going to return all of pear. Okay, so what that means is it's actually returning sub 1, and then it's returning str2. Because this number is bigger than the length of 4, it's going to return the original string, which is pear, but because it's actually less than the first string, we return sub 1. So that's a little confusing, but if we were writing in a real language, in a text-based programming language, we would have to do this. And then the fourth condition is literally just this one, but reversed. Okay, so instead of the number being greater than the length of string 2, it's actually greater than the length of string 1. So it's the opposite of this one. Okay, so what we need to do in our code is we actually need to use some what's called selection. And if you remember, those are our if then else statements. We need to use if then else statements to make these conditions happen. And actually, you know what? I totally forgot. There's one final one. We actually need to first make sure that num is greater than 0, because if it's not, the program does not work. Program does not work. So this will actually probably be our first condition that we do, and then we'll do these other 4. So let's head back over to Scratch. Let's see how we can incorporate these conditions into our code and finish up our program. Okay, so let's see how we can integrate those conditions into our program. So the very first thing I want to do actually is check to make sure that the user types in a positive number, not 0, not a negative. So what I'm actually going to do is separate this whole block of code here. Just move this over to the side for a second. And then I'm going to go over to control, and I'm going to grab an if then else statement. Now, I'm going to go over to operators, and I'm going to grab a comparison operator. And so the one that I want is the greater than operator, and it looks like that. And I want to say, as long as num right here is greater than 0. So once the user enters a number and they set number, we set the number variable to whatever the user types in. If that number is greater than 0, then I am going to run this entire code. Going to run that entire code. Otherwise, I want to go to looks, and I'm going to grab a say block, and I'm going to say something like this. Please enter a positive integer only. Click the green flag to try again. Okay, so let's just test that out first and see if that works. So if I type in, it'll ask me for a string first off. So we'll type in puppy, we'll type in kitten, we'll type in 3. Okay, just to make sure that works. We'll do it again. Puppy, kitten, let's type in 0. And it'll say, please enter a positive integer only. Click the green flag to try again. Try this again. Puppy, kitten, let's just try something like -8. Okay, so that works. So our first condition is fine, right? So it checks to see that we're entering a positive number. Awesome. Okay, great. Probably the easiest thing to do is check to see if the number is greater than the length of both strings. So here's how I do that. I am going to grab, and let me grab an if then else block. And before I do anything, I actually need to pull this out. Okay, and the reason being is that this block of code right here, this is only satisfying the condition if the number is less than the length of both str1 and str2. Okay, only would we do this. I mean, we would only do this if str1 and str2 are both less than the length of those two strings. Sorry, the number is less than the length of both of those two strings. Okay, so what I want to do is this. If the number is greater than 0, okay, and actually let's move out this repeat block too. Let's move that whole block of code out. I'm going to put this if block inside, because notice how I take this if block and I put it inside of another if block. What that means is that this right here will only run if this condition is true. So if the number is greater than 0, then it's going to do this. And here's what we want it to check. We want it to check if the number there is greater than, and I go to operators and I grab length, is greater than the length of string 1, and then I go over to operators, and this here is a Boolean, and what the Boolean does is it's going to say as long as the number is greater than the length of string 1 and I'll just duplicate this, and the number is greater than the length of string 2. And this statement is only true if both this condition and this condition are true. That's what the and means. So both of these conditions have to be true in order for the code to run inside this little area here. Okay, and if that is the case, all we're gonna do is go to looks, we're gonna grab a say block, we're gonna go to operators and grab a join block, and then we're gonna grab str1 and str2. Okay, we don't even need, oops, not that one. We don't even need to do this yet. We don't even need to do this, because if the number is bigger than str1 and str2, we return the whole number anyway, or we return the whole string anyway. So we would just say str1 and str2. So I'll give you an example. Let's run this. And notice this code is not even there. We're not even running this block of code. So let's say I type in dog, I type in cat, and I type in 6. Notice there are not 6 letters in dog and cat. So when I hit enter, it still says dog cat. Okay, that's what we want it to do, okay? Now, but notice if I did this, if I said dog cat and I type in the number 2, nothing happens, because that's where this block of code comes in. So we're not quite back to that point yet. So we've got this first condition. Now the next condition we can look for is, let's do this one next. I'm gonna go over to control again, and I'm gonna grab another if then else. This time I'm gonna put the if statement in the else block. And here's why. So when we run our code, okay, and let's say I type in apple and pear, and I type in the number 4. Okay, and I'll hit 4. Say I type in the number 4. The first thing, once I type in the number 4, okay, I type in the number 4 right here, it gets saved to num, and then it runs this whole section of code. And it first checks is number greater than 0. Well, 4 is greater than 0, cool, so it does the second part. Is 4 larger than both the length of string 1 and string 2? No, it's not. It is larger than, no, it's not larger than any of them. So this is false. And because this is false, it then checks this condition. So it will not do this. It will go down and it will check the else if block. And that's the way you can read this. If this is not true, else if it checks to see if this is true. So here's what we want to do this time. I'm going to grab another and this time I want to check to see if, and I can actually duplicate this first one. So for this condition, I want to check to see if the number is greater than the length of string 1, but not greater than the length of string 2. So the way I could do this, and to make it really easy, I actually have a not Boolean right here. And I'm going to drop the not in there. And I'm just going to come up here and I'm going to duplicate this condition and drop it there. So I'm basically saying, is num bigger than string 1, and is it not bigger than string 2? Okay. Now, if that is the case, this is where it gets a little bit tricky. If it is bigger than than the length of string 2, then I don't need to run this block of code right here on string 2. Sorry, if number is greater than the length of string 1, I do not need to run this block of code on string 1, but I do need to on string 2. So here's what I need to do. What I'm going to do is just duplicate this for a second and stick it there. Okay, so I'm going to keep that block of code there. What I'm going to do is, so because it's greater than string 1, I don't need to do this part. So I'm going to get rid of that. I just want to do this to string 2, which would be sub 2. Okay. And I'm going to drop this little block of code in here. And this time I don't want to join sub 1. I actually want to join string 1. string 1 and sub 2. Okay, let's test this out and see if this works. So I need a string where string 1, where the number is going to be greater than the length of string 1, but not string 2. So let's do this. Let's type in for string 1 dog, and for string 2, let's type kitten. Okay, and let's put the number 4 in. So here's what should happen. If I type in number 4, the number 4, I should get all of dog back and the first 4 letters of kitten. Let's see if that works. Okay, that does work. Perfect. Now, here's the easy part. The next condition is literally this condition here, but the opposite, right? Totally, it's the exact same thing, but opposite. So I'm gonna duplicate, and let me just stop that real quick. I'm gonna duplicate this whole little block of code here, so you'll see it right there, and I'm gonna drop it in the else if. However, this is a little different though. So this time, string 1 is going to be the not. So I'll grab a not. String 1 is gonna be the not. And string 2 is just gonna be the regular one, like that. And then instead of doing sub 2, I want to do sub 1. It's literally the opposite. Sub 1 and string 2. Oops, string 1. Right there. Okay. And then right here, we do this time, we return sub 1 and string 2. All right, so here's what should happen this time. If I run it, I'm just gonna reverse the strings to test it. So I'll do kitten first, dog second, and we'll do the number 4. And we got kit dog, which is perfect because we get the shortened string 1, but the regular string 2. Cool. Now the great thing is if these conditions are not met, so if this condition's false and this condition is false, or sorry, if this condition's false, this condition's false, this condition's false, that's when I do this condition. Because that means I don't even need to put a condition there. Because if these 3 conditions are all false, then that means, it has to mean that the number is less than both string 1 and string 2. So let's test that out. Type in kitten, we'll type in puppy, we'll type in 3, and I should get kit pup. And that brings us to the end of our code. So this was a little tricky, and like I said, in Scratch, you saw it. Scratch actually does not need all of these conditions. However, when you get to other programming languages, you will need to make conditions like this. And so it's just it's good practice to get in the habit of doing that. Well, that brings us to the end of this program. All right, and don't forget, make sure you save your program by clicking the Save button at the top right. If you don't see a Save button there, go over to File and click Save Now. Also, one fun fact, if you are writing code in Scratch and you lose your internet connection or something along those lines, and it does not let you save your program, or let's say you forgot to sign in, there's no way of saving your program. Here's what you can do. You can click File and click Save to your computer. It will save a file to your computer that you can later upload back into Scratch, and you will not lose your code. So just make sure you're saving your work. Otherwise, I will see you next time.